Officer James Morrison had been walking the same route through Buckingham Palace for 8 years. But this Tuesday morning felt different from the moment he stepped through the massive oak doors. The autumn mist clung to the windows, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to whisper of secrets waiting to be discovered. James had always prided himself on his attention to detail. It was this quality that had earned him his position as one of the palace's most trusted security guards, responsible for the early morning patrol that ensured everything was in perfect order before the royal family began their daily activities. His colleagues often joked that James could spot a speck of dust on a chandelier from 50 feet away. But this morning, his keen eye would catch something far more significant. The Queen Consort's private sitting room was always part of his morning route. Usually, the room stood empty at this hour, its elegant furnishings bathed in the soft light that filtered through the heavy curtains. But today, as James approached the doorway, he noticed movement inside. Queen Camilla stood near the tall windows, her silhouette outlined against the morning light as she adjusted something around her neck. James paused, following protocol to ensure he wasn't interrupting anything important. The Queen Consort appeared to be preparing for an early morning engagement, her reflection visible in the ornate mirror that dominated one wall of the sitting room. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented her complexion beautifully, and her silver hair was styled with the understated elegance that had become her signature. But it was what she wore around her neck that made James's breath catch in his throat. The necklace was unlike anything he had ever seen in his years at the palace. A magnificent sapphire, easily the size of a robin's egg, hung from a delicate chain of what appeared to be the finest white gold. The sapphire itself was surrounded by a halo of diamonds that caught the morning light and threw tiny rainbows across the room. But it wasn't just the beauty of the piece that struck James. It was something else, something that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. James had undergone extensive training about the royal jewelry collection. Every guard needed to be familiar with the most valuable pieces, both for security reasons and to ensure proper protocols were followed when they were worn or displayed. He knew the crown jewels intimately, could identify every major piece in the Queen's personal collection, and was familiar with the historical significance of countless brooches, tiaras, and necklaces that had been passed down through generations. This necklace, however, was not in any catalog he had studied. It was not part of any collection he had been briefed about. And, yet, there was something hauntingly familiar about it, something that made his heart race with a mixture of recognition and confusion. Queen Camilla moved closer to the mirror, adjusting the clasp at the back of her neck. The movement caused the sapphire to catch the light once more, and, in that brilliant flash, James experienced a moment of clarity that sent chills down his spine. He had seen this necklace before, not in person, but in a photograph that had been quickly removed from display many years ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was the Midnight Sapphire, a necklace that had supposedly disappeared from the royal collection decades ago. More importantly, it was a necklace that had belonged to someone whose very mention still caused whispered conversations and careful glances among the palace staff. James forced himself to remain calm, continuing his patrol as if nothing unusual had occurred. But his mind raced as he tried to process what he had witnessed. The Midnight Sapphire had a history that was both beautiful and tragic, tied to events that the royal family had worked hard to keep buried in the past. According to the hushed stories that occasionally circulated among longtime palace employees, the necklace had been a favorite of Queen Elizabeth II in her younger years. It had been commissioned by King George VI as a gift for his daughter's 21st birthday, crafted by the finest jewelers in London using a sapphire that had been in the royal family for centuries. The Queen had worn it frequently during the early years of her reign, and it had appeared in numerous official photographs. But then, quite suddenly, it had vanished from public view. No explanation was given, and when curious photographers and royal watchers inquired about it, they were told simply that it had been retired from active use. James remembered now where he had seen it before. There had been a small, framed photograph on his grandmother's dressing table when he was a child. His grandmother, who had worked as a seamstress for the royal household in the 1950s, had treasured that photograph of the young Queen Elizabeth wearing the midnight sapphire at a state dinner. But one day, when James was about 12 years old, the photograph had disappeared. When he asked about it, his grandmother had looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. It wasn't until years later, when James was already working at the palace, that he learned why that photograph had been removed. The necklace, he discovered, had become associated with a period of the Queen's life that she preferred not to remember, a time when the weight of the crown seemed almost too much to bear and when personal struggles threatened to overshadow her public duties. The midnight sapphire had been worn during some of the most difficult moments of the Queen's early reign. She had worn it to the funeral of her beloved father, where its deep blue color had seemed to echo her profound grief. She had worn it during the Suez Crisis, when the weight of political upheaval had tested her resolve. And she had worn it during the constitutional crisis that had nearly torn apart the Commonwealth. Over time, the necklace had become, in the Queen's mind, a symbol of sorrow rather than celebration. According to the whispered accounts James had heard, she had finally ordered it locked away, declaring that she never wanted to see it again. The official story was that it had been damaged and sent away for repairs, but those close to the Queen knew the truth. It had been banished because it carried too many painful memories. So why was Queen Camilla wearing it now? James completed his morning patrol, but his thoughts remained focused on what he had witnessed. He tried to convince himself that he had been mistaken, that the necklace was simply a similar piece that happened to resemble the legendary midnight sapphire. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that his initial identification had been correct. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Queen Camilla was indeed wearing the midnight sapphire, it meant that someone had made the decision to bring it out of its decades-long exile. But who had that authority? And more importantly, why now? As James made his way to the security office to file his routine morning report, he wrestled with whether to mention what he had seen. Protocol demanded that any unusual observations be reported immediately, but he also understood that some subjects were too delicate to be discussed casually. The palace had its own hierarchy of secrets, and James suspected that the midnight sapphire belonged to the highest level of that hierarchy. The morning sun was now streaming through the palace windows with full force, burning away the mist that had given the building its earlier ethereal quality. But for James, the day remained shrouded in mystery. He had witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, and the weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. In the hours that followed, James would find himself watching Queen Camilla whenever their paths crossed in the palace corridors. He noticed that she seemed different somehow, more confident perhaps, or maybe more purposeful. The way she carried herself suggested that she was aware of the significance of what she wore, that the decision to don the midnight sapphire had not been made lightly. But it would be several more hours before James understood the true magnitude of what he had witnessed, and several more days before the implications of Queen Camilla's choice would begin to ripple outward, touching lives and revealing secrets that had been carefully hidden for more than half a century. The midnight sapphire was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a key that could unlock doors that the royal family had thought were permanently sealed, and Queen Camilla had chosen to turn that key. What lay behind those doors would soon shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. By midday, James Morrison found himself unable to concentrate on his duties. The image of Queen Camilla wearing the midnight sapphire had burned itself into his memory, and with each passing hour, he became more convinced that what he had witnessed was significant beyond anything he could have imagined. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him as he went through the motions of his afternoon patrol, checking security protocols and ensuring that the palace operated with its usual seamless efficiency. The royal household was buzzing with activity as preparations were underway for an important state dinner scheduled for that evening. Diplomats from several European nations would be attending, and the palace staff worked with practiced precision to ensure every detail was perfect. James watched the familiar dance of preparation unfold around him, but his thoughts remained fixed on the morning's discovery. It was during his afternoon break that James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of joining his colleagues in the staff cafeteria as he usually did, he made his way to the palace library, a vast repository of royal history that was accessible to senior staff members for research purposes. If he was going to understand the significance of what he had seen, he needed to learn more about the midnight sapphire and its mysterious disappearance from the royal collection. The palace library was a sanctuary of knowledge, its walls lined with volumes that chronicled centuries of royal history. Leather-bound books contained detailed accounts of coronations, state visits, and the personal lives of monarchs stretching back generations. James had visited the library only a few times during his years at the palace, usually to research security protocols for historical events, but today he approached it with a different purpose. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the palace librarian, looked up from her desk with surprise as James entered. A woman in her 70s who had served the royal household for nearly 5 decades, Mrs. Hartwell possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of royal history and an uncanny ability to locate even the most obscure documents within the library's vast collection. James explained that he was researching royal jewelry for a security briefing, which was technically true, though he carefully avoided mentioning the specific piece that had captured his attention. Mrs. Hartwell nodded approvingly and led him to a section of the library dedicated to royal regalia and ceremonial objects. The books in this section were meticulously organized and extensively illustrated with photographs and detailed descriptions of countless pieces of royal jewelry. James spent over an hour carefully examining page after page, looking for any reference to the midnight sapphire. Most of the major pieces were well documented, their histories traced through generations of royal ownership, but the necklace that had caught his eye that morning seemed to have been deliberately omitted from the official records. It was Mrs. Hartwell who finally provided the breakthrough James was seeking. As she noticed his focused search through the jewelry catalogs, she approached with a knowing smile that suggested she understood more than she was letting on. "Looking for something specific, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent guarding royal secrets. James hesitated for a moment, then decided to trust his instincts. Mrs. Hartwell had a reputation for discretion that was legendary among the palace staff, and if anyone could help him understand what he had witnessed, it would be her. "The midnight sapphire," he said quietly. "I'm trying to find information about the midnight sapphire." Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but James caught the flash of recognition in her eyes. She glanced around the library to ensure they were alone, then gestured for James to follow her to a more secluded area among the stacks. "That's not a name you hear spoken very often within these walls," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What makes you ask about it?" James explained that he had come across a reference to it in some old security documents and wanted to understand its historical significance. It was another careful half-truth, but Mrs. Hartwell seemed to accept it. "The midnight sapphire," she said, settling into a chair and gesturing for James to do the same, "is one of the most beautiful pieces ever commissioned for the royal collection, but it's also one of the most tragic." She went on to explain what James had already suspected. The necklace had been created for Queen Elizabeth II's 21st birthday, designed to showcase a magnificent sapphire that had been discovered in the royal collection's archives. The sapphire itself was believed to have originally belonged to Queen Victoria, though its exact provenance was lost to history. "Her Majesty adored it in the early years of her reign," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "She wore it to some of the most important events of the 1950s. There are beautiful photographs of her wearing it at state dinners, formal receptions, and ceremonial occasions. But then, quite suddenly, it disappeared from public view." James leaned forward, captivated by the story. "What happened to it?" Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much she should reveal. "There were personal reasons," she said finally. "The Queen began to associate it with some very difficult times in her life. The death of her father, political crises, personal struggles that the public never knew about. Over time, she came to view the necklace as something of a burden rather than a treasure." The librarian paused, studying James's face carefully. The decision was made to retire it from active use. Officially, it was said to require extensive restoration work, but those of us who had served the Queen for many years understood the real reason. She simply couldn't bear to wear it anymore. James felt his pulse quicken. Where has it been all these years? Locked away in the private vault beneath the palace, Mrs. Hartwell replied. As far as I know, it hasn't seen the light of day for more than 40 years. Access to that vault is restricted to only the most senior members of the royal family, and even then, it requires special authorization. The implications of this information hit James like a thunderbolt. If Mrs. Hartwell was correct, and the Midnight Sapphire had been locked away for 4 decades, then Queen Camilla's possession of it represented something unprecedented. Someone with the highest level of authority had made the decision to retrieve it from its exile, and James couldn't help but wonder why. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Hartwell leaned closer and spoke in an even quieter voice. Mr. Morrison, may I ask why you're really interested in the Midnight Sapphire? Your questions suggest more than casual curiosity. James found himself at a crossroads. He could continue to maintain his cover story and leave the library with the information he had already gathered, or he could trust Mrs. Hartwell with the truth and potentially gain access to insights that could help him understand the full significance of what he had witnessed. The decision was made easier by the genuine concern he saw in the elderly librarian's eyes. Mrs. Hartwell had spent her life serving the royal family with unwavering loyalty, and James sensed that her question came not from nosiness but from a protective instinct that had been honed over decades of service. I saw it this morning, he said simply. Queen Camilla was wearing it. Mrs. Hartwell's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face, and she gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For a moment, James thought she might faint, but then she took a deep breath and composed herself with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to processing shocking information. Are you absolutely certain? She asked, her voice barely audible. James nodded. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Mrs. Hartwell stood up abruptly and began pacing among the library stacks, her mind clearly racing as she tried to process the implications of James's revelation. After several minutes, she returned to where he sat and fixed him with a stare that seemed to penetrate to his very soul. Mr. Morrison, what you've told me suggests that something extraordinary is about to happen, she said. The Midnight Sapphire was not simply retired from use. It was buried because the Queen wanted to bury the memories associated with it. For it to resurface now, and to be worn by Queen Camilla, means that someone has made a decision to confront those buried memories. James felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of memories? Mrs. Hartwell glanced around the library once more, then made a decision that James could see weighing heavily on her conscience. Follow me, she said, leading him deeper into the stacks to a section that appeared to be rarely visited. She retrieved a slim, unmarked volume from a high shelf and opened it to reveal not printed pages, but a collection of photographs and documents that had been carefully preserved between protective sheets. These are some of the photographs that were removed from official circulation when the necklace was retired, she explained, turning the pages slowly. Look carefully at Her Majesty's expression in each of these images. James studied the photographs with growing understanding. In each image, Queen Elizabeth II wore the Midnight Sapphire, but her expression was far from the composed serenity typically associated with royal portraits. Instead, there was a weight of sadness in her eyes, a burden that seemed to increase with each successive photograph. The last time she wore it publicly was in 1962, Mrs. Hartwell explained, turning to a final photograph that showed the Queen at what appeared to be a formal dinner. After that night, she declared that the necklace was to be locked away permanently. She said that some burdens were too heavy to bear, even for a queen. James stared at the final photograph, noting how the magnificent sapphire seemed to echo the profound sadness in the Queen's eyes. What happened in 1962? Mrs. Hartwell closed the album and returned it to its place on the shelf. That, Mr. Morrison, is a story that has never been fully told. But if Queen Camilla has chosen to wear the Midnight Sapphire again, it suggests that the time has come for that story to finally emerge from the shadows. As James left the library, his mind was overwhelmed with questions and implications. The morning's discovery had evolved from a simple observation into something that felt like the first thread in unraveling a decades-old mystery. Whatever had happened in 1962, whatever had caused the late Queen to banish the midnight sapphire from her sight, was somehow connected to Queen Camilla's decision to wear it now. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade as James resumed his duties. But the palace around him seemed different somehow, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of revelations to come. The evening state dinner would proceed with its usual pomp and ceremony, but James knew that beneath the surface of royal protocol, something significant was stirring. The midnight sapphire had returned, and with it, the ghosts of the past were beginning to stir. Whatever secrets had been buried for more than 60 years were preparing to emerge into the light, and James Morrison found himself an unwitting witness to what promised to be one of the most significant moments in modern royal history. The state dinner that evening was a masterpiece of royal protocol and diplomatic elegance. The palace's grand ballroom had been transformed into a glittering showcase of British hospitality, with crystal chandeliers casting their warm light over tables set with the finest china and silverware. Distinguished guests from across Europe mingled with members of the royal family and senior government officials, their conversations a careful blend of personal pleasantries and international diplomacy. James Morrison stood at his assigned position near the main entrance to the ballroom, his trained eye scanning the room for any signs of security concerns. But, despite his professional focus, his attention was repeatedly drawn to Queen Camilla, who moved through the gathering with her characteristic grace and warmth. She wore a stunning evening gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her complexion beautifully, and her jewelry had been chosen to perfection for the formal occasion. But notably absent from her ensemble was the midnight sapphire. Instead, she wore a magnificent diamond necklace that James recognized as one of the Queen's traditional pieces, frequently worn at state functions. The absence of the mysterious sapphire left James with more questions than answers. Had what he witnessed that morning been a private moment? Perhaps Queen Camilla examining the piece in preparation for some future occasion? Or had the decision been made to keep the controversial necklace away from public view, at least for now? As the evening progressed, James found himself studying not just Queen Camilla, but the other members of the royal family present at the dinner. King Charles appeared to be in excellent spirits, engaging warmly with the international guests and demonstrating the diplomatic skills he had honed over decades of royal service. Princess Anne moved through the gathering with her characteristic efficiency and directness, while other senior royals played their parts in the carefully choreographed dance of state hospitality. But James noticed something that might have escaped a less observant eye. There seemed to be an undercurrent of tension among some of the palace staff, particularly those who had served the royal household for many years. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain individuals approached, and James caught several meaningful glances exchanged between senior servants who clearly knew more than they were willing to say. The evening's formal program proceeded without incident. Speeches were delivered with appropriate gravity and warmth, toasts were raised to international friendship and cooperation, and the assembled dignitaries enjoyed a dinner prepared by the palace's world-renowned culinary staff. But, throughout the evening, James remained aware of the undercurrent of anticipation that seemed to flow just beneath the surface of the formal proceedings. It was during the reception following dinner that James noticed Lord Pemberton, the king's private secretary, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with several senior palace officials. The group had gathered in a corner of the room where their discussion was less likely to be overheard, but their body language suggested they were dealing with a matter of considerable importance. Lord Pemberton was a man who had served the royal family with distinction for over 3 decades. His reputation for discretion was legendary, and his ability to manage sensitive situations had made him indispensable to the monarchy. If he was concerned about something, James reasoned, it was likely to be a matter of genuine significance. As the evening wound down and the last of the international guests departed, James prepared to complete his shift and head home. But, as he was conducting his final security check of the ballroom, he overheard a fragment of conversation that stopped him in his tracks. The vault was accessed yesterday evening. One voice was saying, too quietly for James to identify the speaker. After all these years, another voice replied, equally muted but carrying a tone of concern that was unmistakable. James strained to hear more, but the speakers had moved away, leaving him with tantalizing fragments that only deepened the mystery surrounding the Midnight Sapphire. The vault they were discussing had to be the private repository that Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned, the place where the controversial necklace had been stored for 4 decades. The following morning brought an unexpected development that would propel James deeper into the mystery he had stumbled upon. As he arrived for his shift, he was informed by his supervisor that he had been assigned to a special security detail for Queen Camilla's upcoming visit to a children's charity in East London. The assignment was considered an honor, reserved for the most trusted and reliable security personnel, but James couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than coincidence that he had been selected. The drive to East London took them through some of the capital's most diverse neighborhoods, where modern glass towers stood alongside Victorian terraces and bustling markets reflected the city's multicultural character. Queen Camilla spent the journey reviewing briefing materials about the charity they would be visiting, occasionally making notes in the margins with the attention to detail that had become her trademark. James found himself studying her reflection in the car's windows, looking for any sign that she was aware of the significance of what she had worn the previous morning. But Queen Camilla's demeanor remained as composed and professional as always, giving no indication that she was dealing with anything more complex than the day's scheduled engagements. The charity they visited was a remarkable organization that provided educational support and meals for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Queen Camilla moved through the facility with genuine warmth and interest, spending time with individual children and listening intently to the staff members who explained their programs. James was struck by her ability to connect with people from all walks of life, a skill that had served her well throughout her years as a working member of the royal family. But it was during a quiet moment, as Queen Camilla was reading with a small group of children in the charity's library, that James noticed something that sent his pulse racing. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught a flash of blue at her throat, barely visible beneath the high collar of her tailored jacket. She was wearing the Midnight Sapphire again. This time, the necklace was almost completely concealed, visible only when she leaned forward or moved in just the right way to catch the light. But James's trained eye and heightened awareness made him certain of what he was seeing. Queen Camilla had made the deliberate choice to wear the controversial piece, even while keeping it hidden from public view. The implications were staggering. If the necklace was indeed as significant as Mrs. Hartwell had suggested, then Queen Camilla's decision to wear it, even concealed, suggested that she was making some kind of statement or preparing for some momentous revelation. The secrecy surrounding it only added to the sense that something unprecedented was building toward a climax that would have far-reaching consequences for the royal family. As the visit to the charity concluded and they prepared to return to the palace, James found himself wrestling with a decision that could define the rest of his career. He had stumbled upon what appeared to be one of the royal family's most closely guarded secrets, and every instinct told him that the situation was building toward something that would require careful handling. That evening, after completing his shift, James made another visit to the palace library. Mrs. Hartwell was preparing to leave for the day when he arrived, but she agreed to stay when she saw the urgent expression on his face. "She's wearing it again," he said without preamble. "Hidden, but she's wearing it." Mrs. Hartwell's face went pale. "Mr. Morrison, I think the time has come for you to understand the full significance of what you've witnessed. But what I'm about to tell you must never leave this room." She led him to the same secluded area where they had talked the day before, but this time she retrieved a different volume from the shelves, one that looked even older and more carefully preserved than the previous collection. "In 1962, she began, opening the book to reveal documents that appeared to be personal correspondence. Something happened that nearly shattered the Queen's faith in the monarchy itself. She was facing pressures that the public never knew about, dealing with crises that tested every principle she held dear. The documents she showed James were letters, written in the Queen's own hand, expressing doubts and fears that seemed impossible to reconcile with the composed figure the world knew. The letters spoke of sleepless nights, of questioning whether she was worthy of the crown she wore, of wondering whether the institution of monarchy could survive in a rapidly changing world. The midnight sapphire became, in her mind, a symbol of all those doubts and fears, Mrs. Hartwell explained. Every time she wore it, she was reminded of the weight of responsibility that sometimes felt too heavy to bear. The final straw came during a particularly difficult state visit, when a photograph was taken of her wearing the necklace while meeting with a foreign dignitary who challenged everything she believed about her role as sovereign. She turned to a newspaper clipping that showed that final photograph, the one that had prompted the Queen to banish the necklace forever. In it, Queen Elizabeth II looked more vulnerable and uncertain than the public had ever seen her, the magnificent sapphire around her neck seeming to weigh her down rather than elevate her. After that night, Mrs. Hartwell continued, she declared that the necklace was cursed, not in any supernatural sense, but cursed with the weight of memories that were too painful to bear. She ordered it locked away, and she made everyone involved swear that it would never be spoken of again. James stared at the documents, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Queen Camilla's actions might represent. If she's wearing it now, then she's either confronting those buried memories, Mrs. Hartwell finished, or she's preparing to reveal truths that have been hidden for 60 years. Either way, Mr. Morrison, you've witnessed the beginning of something that will change the royal family forever. As James left the library that night, his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. The midnight sapphire was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a key to understanding the most vulnerable period in Queen Elizabeth II's long reign, a symbol of doubts and fears that had shaped her approach to monarchy for the rest of her life. And now Queen Camilla was wearing it, preparing to unlock secrets that had been carefully guarded for generations. Whatever her intentions, James realized that he had become an unwitting witness to history in the making, and the knowledge weighed on him like the ancient sapphire itself weighed on its royal wearer. 3 days after James Morrison's discovery in the Charities Library, an emergency meeting was called in the palace's most secure conference room. The gathering included only the highest-ranking officials: Lord Pemberton, the King's private secretary; Sir Michael Thornton, the keeper of the Privy Purse; Lady Catherine Ashworth, the Queen Consort's private secretary; and several senior security personnel who had served the royal household for decades. James had not been invited to this meeting, but his position monitoring the palace's internal communication systems meant that he was aware of its unusual nature. Emergency meetings of this caliber were called only when the royal family faced situations that could potentially threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. The last such meeting had been convened during the constitutional crisis following Princess Diana's death, and, before that, during the abdication crisis of 1936. What James didn't know was that his own observations had been the catalyst for this gathering. His supervisor had followed protocol and reported his questions about the midnight sapphire to higher authorities, triggering a chain of quiet investigations that had now reached the highest levels of the palace hierarchy. Lord Pemberton opened the meeting with a gravity that reflected the seriousness of the situation. A man of impeccable discretion who had served 3 monarchs during his illustrious career, he was known for his ability to navigate the most delicate political and personal crises with skill and tact. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of royal service. "We are gathered here to discuss a development that has the potential to reshape our understanding of recent royal history. It has come to our attention that Her Majesty Queen Camilla has accessed the sealed vault containing items from Queen Elizabeth II's private collection." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Everyone present understood the significance of what had been revealed. The sealed vault beneath Buckingham Palace was legendary among senior palace staff, a repository for items that had been deliberately removed from public view for reasons that ranged from personal sentiment to matters of state security. Sir Michael Thornton, whose responsibilities included overseeing the royal family's private collections, spoke next. His face was pale, and his usually steady voice carried a tremor that betrayed his distress. "The vault was accessed 3 nights ago. using authorization codes that have not been used in over 40 years, he reported. Only 4 people in the world have knowledge of those codes. His Majesty King Charles, Her Majesty Queen Camilla, myself, and my predecessor, who passed away in 2018. The electronic logs show that the access was legitimate, but the item that was retrieved. He paused, struggling with the words. In the shadowed corridors of Buckingham Palace, where every whisper carries the weight of history and every glance holds 1,000 secrets, there exists a vault known only to a select few. Deep beneath the marble floors and golden chandeliers lies a collection of jewels so precious, so deeply entwined with the monarchy's most guarded mysteries, that their very existence has been erased from public records. For 70 years, these jewels remained untouched, locked away in the darkness, their stories buried with the woman who once wore them. But on a crisp autumn morning in 2024, when the morning light streamed through the palace windows just as it had for centuries, one sharp-eyed royal guard would witness something that would send shockwaves through the very foundations of the British royal family. What he saw around Queen Camilla's neck would unravel a secret so profound, so carefully concealed, that it would force the palace to confront a truth they had spent decades trying to forget. This is the story of a discovery that changed everything, a moment when the past refused to stay buried, and a revelation that proved some secrets are too powerful to remain hidden forever. The jewel that caught the morning light that day was more than just a piece of royal regalia. It was a key to understanding one of the monarchy's most closely guarded mysteries, a thread that, when pulled, would unravel a tapestry of secrets, lies, and long-forgotten truths that the royal family had hoped would never see the light of day.